Welcome to the Rural Social Worker Closing the Gaps Despite the Distance podcast. I am your host, Andrea Charles, and this is the space where we will delve into the heart of rural landscapes and explore the essential role of social workers in bridging the gaps in rural social work. Join me as we navigate the unique challenges, celebrate the triumphs, and uncover the stories that shape the fabric of rural life. Together, let's embark on a journey to understand the transformative impact of social workers in the forgotten communities of our nation. A quick note, while our discussions provide valuable insight, please remember that this podcast is not a substitute for official supervision or guidance in your professional practice. Hello, everyone. Andrea here, and thank you for joining me today for episode 3, Exploring Ethical Practices in Rural Communities. We are going to discuss ethical dilemmas, challenges, and boundaries that are unique to rural communities. The NASW Code of Ethics does not adequately address ethical concerns specific to rural communities, so that makes it difficult for us to use the Code of Ethics as the only source of guidance. Now, it definitely is a huge source of guidance, and it is super helpful when navigating these ethical dilemmas, whether that be in a rural community or an urban community. I am just saying it can't be the only source because of the uniqueness that is in rural communities. So I want to define what an ethical dilemma is first. 3 conditions need to be present for a situation to be considered an ethical dilemma. First, there must be a situation where a decision needs to be made. Second, there must be different options to decide upon. And third, there is no solution where an ethical principle is not compromised in some way. If any of these 3 conditions are not present, then it is not considered an ethical dilemma. Overall, an ethical dilemma is comprised of ethics, morals, laws, and values, and they're often competing with and against each other. Research stated that many rural providers viewed boundaries and ethics differently than their urban counterparts. In addition, what might be a boundary violation in an urban community is at times acceptable in a rural setting. Research also stated that rural healthcare would be improved if there was more development around rural ethics. This would include an improvement around knowledge, research, and teaching so that social workers can better grasp the concept and scope of rural practice. Now, I don't know about others, but when I have an ethical dilemma, and let's say I make the wrong choice, I only make that wrong choice once, and it becomes an incredibly hard learning experience. However, I don't do it again because I learned so much from it. And research shows that this is something that happens often, where past actions are a catalyst for positive improvements in future situations and practice. In rural communities, it is important for social workers to be more aware and discerning of ethical dilemmas and how they impact their work, to be always aware of them and where their own boundary lines are. In rural communities, it is important for social workers to be more aware and discerning of ethical dilemmas and how they impact their work, to be always aware of them and where their own boundary lines are. Ethical situations come up more than we would like as social workers. I know personally I would love that they never would come up, but that's not the case. They can show up as conflicts of interest, dual relationships, which was discussed in more detail in episode 2, dual relationships in rural communities. They can also show up as boundary issues, cultural awareness issues, and self-disclosure, to name a few. You have to remember the reason why it is important for social workers to be more aware and discerning of ethical dilemmas in their communities is because the pot is so small. Those dual relationships are happening. You're seeing people outside of the professional scope, and it's important to know where those boundaries are and how to navigate them, because you have to be more careful. In an urban community, we can just have up a wall and we don't, you don't have to have anything to do with your clients outside a session. In a rural community, that's often not the case. And so that's important. So I want to talk about boundaries first. Specifically, after talking about the dual relationships in the previous episode, boundaries are, like I say before, they can be viewed differently in rural communities. And how you have those boundaries set up really helps how you handle those dual relationships. They go hand in hand. So what is a boundary? So there are boundary crossings and boundary violations. So in one article I came across is to define the difference between a boundary crossing and a violation. And they stated that a boundary crossing is merely bending the code, whereas a boundary violation is actually breaking the code. So not all boundary crossings are unethical. However, they do have the potential to be so. It's a slippery slope. So you have to make sure that you are keeping in mind when setting and keeping appropriate boundaries or your own self-disclosure. And boundaries in general, the purpose of them are to help the client feel safe and have trust within the professional relationship. So that's where, having professional boundaries around what you share, what you do not share, how you share is important. So use of self is an interesting concept, and it's how we connect with clients, especially in rural communities. One article stated that the relationship is the cornerstone of change. That means our use of self is also part of that cornerstone. Use of self is how we connect with clients, build rapport, and build trust. In rural communities, clients often appreciate therapists who embody authenticity and relatability. Sharing genuine aspects of your own experiences within the professional boundaries can establish common ground and build trust. Whether discussing shared experiences of living in rural communities and personal challenges, the therapist's authenticity fosters a sense of connection and understanding. So I was listening to this podcast and it talked about how we need to rethink some of our boundaries because we need to lower that wall between us and the client, making us more personable, making us more human, and it helps. However, that has to be done delicately because you don't want to overshare, because you don't want the client to sit there thinking, why am I listening to the story? What the heck does this have to do with anything? And why does she only talk about herself? You want it to be appropriate, just like any other self-disclosure. It has to be appropriate to the situation. So, I often share if parents who have kids with ADHD and they're struggling, I will say, I had a kid with ADHD and this is what worked for me. Maybe you could try that. And that's where I leave it. I don't go into detail in the history or where we struggled or how we struggled or how awful it was or the issues we had unless it is relevant. Some parents sometimes feel like they're never going to get past this. And so I'll say, what? My son is graduating high school this year and he's thriving after all of that. So it is okay to share if it is relevant and you're not trying to get something out of it. So try to keep it short, keep it simple, and keep it relevant. One thing to also keep in mind about boundaries is boundaries have a direct relationship to burnout. So if you're doing things beyond your scope, or you're taking on more roles than you should, or you're trying to delicately play these two different roles of both professional and the community member, you can be at higher risk for burnout depending on how you're navigating those. So some people are very, very good at keeping very clear, very separate boundaries. Others are not. And it's also a comfort level. It's about knowing within yourself, can you handle this? Is this appropriate? Going with that good gut instinct. And that's a self-awareness piece of knowing what you're doing and then reflecting on it to see if you're doing it correctly. And always checking in to make sure you're doing what you think you should be doing and how you think you should be doing it. And also discussing it with colleagues about those different conversations so that you can make sure you're maintaining good ethical practice. Because in rural social work, you may be the only provider or maybe just one of few. And so you have very limited resources. You have long hours. You're doing crisis services. You're also becoming a member of society. You're integrating a member into the community. And if you come into a rural community and you are not part of that community, that leads to higher isolation and can increase burnout further if you are not getting involved in that community. So because you feel like you don't have a life, you feel like you just go to work and go home, you feel very isolated. So you have to get involved in that community. One of the articles I read talked about positive work relationship environments and effective supervision contribute to successfully navigating dealing with dual relationships and conflicts of interest. However, those are lacking in rural communities. You can make connections in other rural communities. So maybe neighboring communities to kind of get together. I knew this one group and it was like a group of 4 or 5 people and they were all from different rural communities within the state. So there were, some of them were an hour apart, some were 5 hours apart. It didn't matter. They were all rural communities in the same state or in the same, like the Pacific Northwest. And they got together on Zoom, which technology made connections so much easier and able to facilitate those discussions and connect with people so much easier. So while they were, hours apart, they were still able to get together on Zoom once a month and talk about their issues and the things that were going on in their community. So making connections and immersing yourself not only in the community, but making connections with other providers in the community can prevent feelings of isolation for social workers. And that's where group supervision can also assist navigating difficult ethical dilemmas and difficult relationships and difficult situations. Because you can talk about it. It isn't just you trying to navigate this all on your own. It's always good to connect with others when in doubt, or just in general, it's good to connect with others. And remember, anyone you run across in the community could turn around and be your client the next day. So consultation can be very beneficial when making sure that your boundaries are ethical. Boundaries are also influenced by self-disclosure, and use of self can be very beneficial when working with clients, but you must be careful not to cross boundaries. Transparency is also key to navigating the therapist's use of self effectively in rural social work. Social workers should be transparent about their intentions, their boundaries, their limitations from the outset. So establishing clear expectations with your clients. Strategic self-disclosure, when appropriate and clinically relevant, can enhance the therapeutic alliance and validate those clients' experiences. You just need to have caution when doing it so that you avoid distracting them from their therapeutic process and making it not about. You got to be careful. You don't want to make it about you. I often talk to my trainees about use of self and how to use it appropriately with their work with clients. I also discuss that it is very important to work through your own issues so that when you do utilize use of self, it is appropriate. If we haven't worked through our own baggage, how can we use what we're going through and not make it come off as we're trying to get therapy or pity from the client? So it's important to understand how use of self impacts the clients. I had a client the other day who they really struggle with people pleasing, and they were worried that what they talked to me the previous week, I had taken home and it had been awful for me. That's what they envisioned in their head. So I had to sit down with them and have a conversation with them about how, no, I do not take it home. Oftentimes I write the note and then they're out of my head. I had to be very careful about how I was saying this because I didn't want to hurt their feelings and think, oh, it's, blow them off and say, no, I don't do that. Or not making them feel important by saying, no, I don't think about clients outside my office, but also saying, like, I can handle and sit here and hear your hard stuff and I'm okay. And it is not their job to make sure I'm okay. This happened because they saw a therapist previously who did do that. The therapist would call them at home and talk to them about their issues. They had people in common, and one of the people died that they had in common. And so the therapist was talking and getting comfort from my client, which was so many levels of inappropriate. But it made the client feel like they had to take care of the therapist and they had to be careful in what they said so that it did not negatively impact and make the therapist's life harder. You don't want to use self that way. That is not appropriate. And that is a total boundary violation it's not just boundary crossing. To me, it's a boundary violation. So there are ways to navigate it appropriately and there are ways to navigate it inappropriately. So talking about some personal examples of boundaries to kind of see how they play out in rural communities and how I kind of navigate them, I want to start out with somebody who I had that completed suicide. So I saw him and I didn't know where he was connected in the community. He wasn't even actually from this community. He was outside in another rural community that's about 40 minutes away. And so I really didn't expect to have any clients affected by it. However, even though the rural community was 40 minutes away, a lot of the rural communities around where we live, they all know each other, because what one rural community doesn't have, then the other one might. And so you may be driving into town to get groceries or going to Costco or the store or whatever. And we have shopping down here that we don't have up in Moscow, and vice versa. And in Orfino, there may be just a grocery store, and these are all little small towns around where I live. So, I got a call from this person's parent that just basically said they're not going to make it in because they completed suicide, which was a shocker in and of itself. And one reason that was first I want to start with why that played out, because that is important to rural communities. So the parent of this person, the family did not want to acknowledge that they had even died. I don't even think there was a death notice in the paper. And so, because there was so much shame around their mental health because of religious issues, and also because of the basics that we are rural. So it was very shocking, because it was very matter of fact, and it was not what I expected when I walked in that day to hear that. So that being said, I took the day. I actually took about 2 days. We sat down, we talked about it. As a staff, we talked about our feelings around it and really tried to do some self-care around it. I reached out to several other clinicians that I know. None of them had ever experienced it, so it was difficult. I was in my doctoral program at the time, and so some of my classmates had actually gone through it. So they were a huge support. Fast forward like a week, and I'm sitting there, and I'm usually pretty good about my poker face, and not in the sense, poker face in that you can't really shock me, or if you do, I don't really show you. And I had a client who started talking about how they knew this person that, was my client. And when they started talking about it, there was no hiding on my face. And I just had to stay silent, because the client that was talking to me, they knew exactly what I was thinking, I think. And we just kind of sat there, and I let them talk about him and let them process through. And I didn't say much. At the end of the during the session, they're like, well, you knew him, didn't you? I know he came here. And again, I didn't say anything, but I know 100% that my face gave it away. And so there's a lot of guilt around that for me, not maintaining that confidentiality, because just because you die doesn't mean that doesn't happen. But there's a lot of less degrees of separation in rural communities. There's maybe 1 or 2 people between you and another person. It says 7, 8, or 9, or even more in urban communities. And so when people die or when things happen, it is not uncommon for it to come into your therapy office. And so I, since then, have kind of ran it through my head of, if that situation comes up again, how am I going to handle it? Because I have to handle it differently than that. And like I've said a lot of times, you only make mistakes once, right? That exact mistake. So that is something that is really hard. And when you think about other things that happen, we had a incident where at the high school, these 2 girls were killed in a car accident in Arizona. And one of the kids was in my kids' class. Well, that had a ripple effect in the community and affected a lot of people I knew. Now, I didn't know these girls personally, so it was a little bit easier to remove myself. However, I did, my son also worked with one of the girls, and I think it kind of hit him like, this is somebody my age. Not that they were super close, but this is somebody his age that had died. And going through that myself, I know that's hard. And so I did have that piece of it where I was helping him kind of go through it. And then I had several clients that were connected. Well, in that, I realized there's a lot of people that come in my office that have kids, my kids' age, that I was not even aware of. So we had a lot of conversations about that. Like, now that we know this, you might see me at school functions, which is funny because, going to school functions, I'm pretty oblivious to what's going around me. But it's kind of like once you see the person, you can't unsee them. And I think they came to a lot more things and we were at a lot more things than I realized. And so having that conversation, I was at a soccer meeting the other day and a parent was there that comes in our office. And so we had a conversation. I'm like, if it bothers you, I don't have to be involved in that piece, or I can get you another therapist. So those are some examples of boundaries that are just pretty blatantly obvious, but also that come up very often. Another one is giving out your cell phone number. So there are many clients that have my cell phone number. I don't give it to everyone. There has to be a level of trust. Not one person I've ever given it to, though, has ever abused the privilege of having it. They don't text me. Usually it's like, I'm sick, I can't make it, I need to reschedule. It's very basic stuff. And so, when you give that out, when I give it out anyway, I'm like, listen, guys, if I don't answer, it's because I'm out of service, because I do go places that do not have service. That's also a common thing in rural community. When I go to the lake, I don't have service. When I go to our cabin, I don't have service. So figuring out those things, but also saying, if that's an emergency, do not call or text my cell phone. Like, that's not a good way to get a hold of me if it's an emergency. If it's something that can be answered later on, or it's not a big hurry or whatever, then that's when I'm allowing them to use my cell phone. And like I said, nobody's ever abused it. However, I have friends that work in urban communities, and that would never be something they do. Even in the rural community, there's a lot of people who do not do that. I personally, that's a boundary that I'm okay with. Another boundary that I'm okay with is working after hours for people. So if they need a resource and I'm like, yeah, here, I'll shoot it to you. No problem. I don't mind doing that. A lot of people do. So I feel like I am pretty available to my clients. But again, I do not feel like anybody takes advantage of it. Like I said, I'm very particular on who gets my cell phone number, and you don't get it, the first time you walk in. And that also means being more flexible with your time. So that may be working out of the, normal 9 to 5 or 9 to 4, or you might be seeing people on Saturdays. You might be doing that because of how small the rural community is. Often people at their jobs, they don't have as much flexibility as if they worked in a larger area. So we have to be more flexible with time and being able to get people in. That also might involve working beyond your scope. So one thing that I do to work when I'm working beyond my scope of practice is I make sure that I'm staffing it with someone. That may be somebody in a urban community, but I've worked in a rural community long enough that I know how to tailor things to it. So that is very helpful. And so it is not uncommon in rural communities to work beyond your scope of practice. It is very important, though, if you are doing so, that you are seeking supervision from somebody who knows and has worked with the population you're trying to work with and can give you tips, and then working to tailor those to a rural community. That is how we grow as therapists too. So I feel like that's an ethical way to manage that. Another one, a boundary example in rural communities, is financial. So we have a lot of financial boundaries, and they're important in the field we're in because we are usually fee for service. And so that is important to know our worth and know our value. However, there are situations where people cannot pay, or they cannot get services anywhere. Nobody takes Medicaid. It's hard to find services for Medicaid around here. One way that I do that or manage that myself is I offer pro bono slots. I usually make my employees carry one. Oftentimes, though, we're carrying more than one person, and there can be pro bono for 1 year, and then they go to a sliding fee, which has a nominal fee amount. So that's another way that I bridge that gap. I also will at times write off things. Probably more so I did when I was just me or when we were smaller. I don't do it as much anymore because I've kind of been burned. I feel like some people have taken advantage of that, or they've just not paid, and then they know I'm not going to send them to collections, so they're like, oh, well, I'll just deal with it. The other boundary is how involved you want to be as your professional self within the community. So we work on our office is on a very busy street, and it is it's not called Main Street, but it is like the main street for the community. So parades are on that street. They shut down for, like, they call it Flavors of Downtown. They shut it down for Halloween and for other events. And most businesses are out on the sidewalk talking to clients, getting it, giving them something for free, or a discount. So we have done more in the community in the last year than we ever have. We got involved in Halloween and Flavors of Downtown. And so Flavors of Downtown, that was one where the community members each gave either a discounted item or a free item. And that's hard when you are a clinical social worker, because what are you going to give for free? So we had fidget toys that I had my husband and I had 3D printed, and some of my kids had. And I sold those or gave them away for free to some people as they came through and then also a brochure of kind of our services. And then Halloween, we gave out candy. In each of those things we did, though, with the community, we had several clients come up, say hello. Ex-clients come up and say, oh, they bring their kids. Do you remember so-and-so? Look at my hair. I got it cut. How are you doing? They're discharged. This is what I've been up to. So those boundaries kind of have to go out in a rural community. And I do feel like we are more connected, and we are serving our mission and our purpose and our community better by getting involved in these events than we were ever before. And so keeping that in mind and making sure that you are thinking about, what am I comfortable with and how do I navigate it? And if I'm not comfortable with that exactly, how can I maybe meet them in the middle so that you're comfortable with your boundaries and you feel like you're maintaining your own professionalism? Oftentimes I tell people, go with your gut, because if your gut's saying it's uncomfortable, there's usually a reason. So trust yourself. The last example of boundaries that I want to give is about self-disclosure. Now, I know that I already talked a little bit about that, but I wanted to touch on kind of what you tell people and making sure that what you're telling them won't be used against you. So it's not just about like self-disclosure in your family or your personal life, but also like your past experiences, maybe with therapy or with situations, and being very careful on how you utilize self-disclosure and making sure that it's not something somebody can use against you later, or that they're going to come back and say, well, you said this. Or the other thing about self-disclosure is like political beliefs and religious beliefs. Sometimes clients will ask those of you, and in rural communities, I think it's a little bit more important to be transparent. And so I keep it very simple and, maybe say I'm a Christian or whatever. I don't go into detail. I'm not trying to convince them to become a Christian. I'm not going to do that. Political beliefs, I'm a little more leery of, just because in a rural community, oftentimes the entire community typically leans one way or the other. And if you don't agree with that, they do not like that. Another example of a self-disclosure that I had with a trainee that I was supervising her, and they had a client that disclosed that they attempted to try to complete suicide, but that their dog was a hang-up. And the intern that I was training stated that they related it to a similar way after their sexual abuse in college and adopting a dog. And so I made sure, like, hey, don't go into that much detail. They don't need to know about sexual abuse. They don't need to know anything about that, because then they could use that against them in the future, or it's also too much self-disclosure. So I think it's important to have balance of being able to relate, but not jeopardize yourself, and knowing what is an appropriate form of disclosure versus just throwing everything out there. In rural communities, the therapist's authenticity, cultural competence, and ability to navigate dual relationships plays a pivotal role in successful therapy outcomes. Conflicts of interest are not uncommon in rural communities where tight-knit social networks often blur the lines between personal and professional relationships. Navigating these conflicts of interest requires transparency, integrity, and a commitment to upholding trust with people you see and in the community. We have often had situations where people want to be seen by our office and there's an obvious conflict of interest, which I can't share them with them. And so this can go a couple different ways. They either accept it and they're like, okay, totally understand that. Do you have options or places that you might recommend? Or they get angry and demand to know why. So then I have to explain why I cannot tell them. And that also leads to like other things. So I had a therapist tell me the other day that they were talking to, they do telehealth only, and they were talking, and one client was telling a story of their day, and then later on, they had another client telling a story of their day. The exact same situation was going on, and those two were interwoven together, but the therapist had no idea. And then you have to decide, is this an issue? Is this conflict of interest? Is this a conflict of interest? Sometimes it is, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it doesn't matter. But sometimes it is. And so you have to figure out how you're going to navigate that. The other thing that I've come across is like, people will talk about things in session. And so then when I have somebody come across my desk, if they want services or they're either self-referred or referred by the doctor, if something jogs my memory, I'm like, okay, let's research that, see why that jogs my memory, and is it a conflict of interest? So conflict of interest in my mind is a little bit different than dual relationships, because conflict of interest for me is like, nope, hard pass, you cannot go there. You cannot do it. Where dual relationships sometimes have a gray area and you can have those dual relationships. So it's important to know and be aware of conflicts of interest, and also thinking about what you'll do in different situations to help you navigate them when they do happen. Oftentimes, if you're transparent and you can have transparency, which I understand is not always possible, it is often helpful. So if it is possible. Okay, so some examples of conflicts of interest that I have come across. So one of them is, you have a client and they love coming in here and they're like, oh, can you see my husband, or can you see my kid, or can you see my aunt, can you see my cousin? And so that is a conflict of interest. One benefit that we have is we have other providers in the office that can see them. And so oftentimes there's a lot of families coming in that are, maybe their wife is seeing one clinician, their husband is seeing another, their kid is seeing another. But it's not uncommon where we have to have that conversation of like, you know what, we cannot see them. I cannot. It's a conflict of interest for me to see you and to see them. And the way I explain it to them always is, you need a therapist completely on your side. They need a therapist completely on their side. If I saw them, I would go in with my bias around what I've already know about them, and that is unfair to both of them. Usually that does it, and they can understand it. Sometimes it doesn't, and they kind of get their feelings hurt, and so you have to navigate that. Another example is seeing somebody a family member is related to. So it is important that even if you're not related to them, if you know somebody personally and they're related to that person, that should never be something that you do. It can put you in a tough position ethically, morally, and just in the family in general, and them maybe expecting you to say something to them. So it's just better to steer clear of that and make sure that you are maintaining good ethical boundaries around that of not having, because that is a conflict of interest. Another one I've come across is somebody reaching out to me that I knew from like elementary school. Now, while I haven't maybe seen them since elementary school, there still could be a bias, and it still could be a potential conflict of interest. And this is what makes it hard with conflicts of interest in rural communities, because we are fortunate in our community. We are rural, but we're not like super rural. So we have other therapists and other agencies that we can refer to. We are all full, so getting into those other places are very hard, but it is a little easier to find them somebody. And sometimes we'll say, well, I'll call up a friend and say, can you take this person? I can't see them for this reason. And maybe they have somebody who they, is outside their scope of practice, or they feel like they've hit the end of their therapeutic, and I can take that person from. So sometimes I've done that. to help with that conflict of interest so that I'm not having to approach it. There are lots of conflicts of interest. However, there's just the blaringly obvious ones that we have to be very careful of. And when they show up, even if they're not obvious, is dealing with them right away, not letting it just go. So I've had a conflict of interest come up where I realized I saw somebody for 6 months and then realized I went to high school with their daughter. And then I remembered all these stories their daughter used to say about their parents. And so I had some bias. And so we had to have a conversation about that of like, okay, I don't feel like I can ethically treat you and not have any bias. I am a big proponent of transparency and honesty when talking to clients about why you can't see them or why it's a conflict of interest. So just keeping that in mind when you're dealing with conflicts of interest. So confidentiality. That is not an ethical principle that varies much between rural and urban communities. There is not much you do differently because it's a universal guideline and law, and it is always important to reinforce this when working in rural communities, because where that differs is that people think that you should share information with them and that you shouldn't need a release of information. Another thing that I would imagine is quite different when sharing information is I often have people sign releases to talk to more collateral people. So they're not only signing releases for parents, spouses, kids, partners, doctors, but we're also talking to pastors, schools, community leaders, family members, old teachers, and of course other therapists. That's probably one that other people do. But we're looking at many more of the collateral supports. And more often than not, in a rural community, we are trying to look for a team to come alongside someone and not just the individual. And there are a lot of informal networks within rural communities, which is why having a release of information is so vital. So you never get in the position where you're accidentally sharing information that you should not be sharing. This is an area where I have witnessed things lacking, and it is mainly because of how rural communities function. It is important to remember to always maintain confidentiality and discuss things with people you have permission to do so. It doesn't matter how if you have a pastor and they refer somebody and they're your pastor too, that doesn't mean you automatically need to have that conversation. You still need to release information. So making sure that you're just maintaining that good ethical boundary of keeping everything confidential. I was talking to a therapist the other day who recently went through a class on play therapy and discussed the difference between rural and urban communities and how cultural awareness was a huge piece of that training. And they talked about how parent-engaged play is cultural and traditions enter the therapy room to help facilitate change in a way that meets the clients where they're at. Cultural matters and beliefs affect mental health. And learning about the client's culture can change the treatment plan. So, for example, back up. So, for example, in the Nez Perce Native American culture, storytelling is how they engage in teaching and connecting with the younger generation. Having cultural awareness of those you are working with helps because you're more effective in helping them. I know that when I know more about where the client comes from, it helps me find their strengths and practice more ethically. This includes the culture in rural communities and understanding that part of the culture is being part of it so that they can trust you and feel that you are invested in them and their community. It also helps understand that the culture impacts change, and it can also change how you manage their treatment. But it also helps you know what can and cannot happen and the barriers regarding culture and how those work in the community of what they can and cannot do. Like, is this a barrier for them to seek services? You know that barrier exists because you live in that community. Culture awareness plays a pivotal role in facilitating inclusivity, strengthening social bonds, promoting overall community well-being in rural communities. I am going to talk more about cultural awareness in rural communities in its own episode later on in the season. But embracing cultural diversity begins with active listening and a genuine curiosity about the different ways of life. Community-based cultural events, education programs, intercultural dialogue, all play a role in fostering greater understanding and appreciation of diverse cultural perspectives in rural communities. And clients can come from diverse backgrounds with distinct cultural norms and values. That could be the marginalized populations, Medicaid, Medicare, farming communities, and so many more. So there are things that you can do that can help you uphold your own boundaries and maintain good ethical practice. So boundaries in specific, one thing I do is I've really beefed up my informed consent. So I include all the normal stuff like confidentiality, disclosures, where to file a complaint, the risks and benefits, and the cost. But I also include information about my social media policy and if I see them in public, how that will be handled. I also discuss how we handle crisis situations, which I imagine looks a little bit different in the rural setting. So how we handle crisis situations is we help bridge the gap between them and a crisis service. So if we may give them the number, we may meet them at the ER, we may just direct them to the ER, depending on the level of severity. And so we kind of have a process in place of how we evaluate the severity, and it is often where we just have to give out the crisis number and then they call. Oftentimes the clients maybe in that position don't think about the crisis number off the top of their head, and so they may call the office and talk to us, and that's where we can offer that. Sometimes we do come in and meet with them for emergency sessions, but that is pretty rare. And honestly, it's pretty rare that the clientele that we work with have a lot of crisis, but it does happen. And so in addition to the informed consent, it's important to have conversations with clients prior to problems coming up. So while I do have them sign my informed consent, I can't guarantee that they read it. Oftentimes people just click through things and I don't know if they read it. So I will go over my social media policy, my no-show policy, my own personal boundaries in that first session and first meeting with that client so that they know where I stand. And you may not be able to get ahead of all issues, but the more that happens, the better you get at doing so. I also often think about how I will handle situations differently after they do not like or after I don't like how they went, so that if they come up again, because a variation of them will, it is important to know what I'm going to do in that situation. So I always kind of role play it in my head of like, okay, if this happens again, how am I going to handle it differently? One thing that I always tell my staff as well is if it's not documented, it did not happen. So when ethical issues come up, remember to always document it so that you're covering yourself and you also have it for future reference. And if you're ever in doubt about what or how you want to handle things, always reach out to someone who can help you. And that may mean that you consult with a few different people to know what is the best route. But it's always better to have a consultation and make sure you're doing the right thing than not have that consultation and it not be the right thing. So we need to make sure that we can put our pride aside and have that consultation piece and admit when we're wrong and admit when we need to make changes and then make those changes. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. I enjoyed giving you this information. I look forward to next time. If there are stories or issues that you face in your practice and you would like me to discuss those on this podcast, please send me a message at theruralsocialworker@gmail.com and I will be happy to take a look. One of the goals of this podcast is storytelling, and I believe that to be impactful, you need context, and that is where stories come in. They give us something to work with and something to build on. I also believe that stories from multiple different rural communities will offer more information and provide more support to rural social workers everywhere. So with that said, I hope you enjoyed this episode and will subscribe for more. Thank you for joining me for another insightful episode of The Rural Social Worker. If you've enjoyed our exploration into the vital work of social work in rural communities, be sure to subscribe, share, and connect with me on social media. Your support helps me continue my mission of closing the gaps and fostering resilience in the places that often go unnoticed. Remember, this podcast is not a substitute for official supervision in your professional journey. Until next time, stay engaged, stay informed, and keep making a difference in rural communities.